Good morning, everyone. My name is Nirmal. I'm working as an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering, Government College of Engineering, Dharmaburi. Today, we are going to see about disaster management. These are the various topics we are going to see in the disaster management. First one, a definition of a disaster. A disaster can be defined as any occurrence that causes damage, ecological dispersion, loss of human life, deterioration of health and health services on a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside affected community or an area. So, disaster is a serious disturbance, okay, which interrupt the functioning of a community or a society. We know that it will result in sustainable loss of human, material, economical, or social condition, which exceeds the ability of an affected community, that is the people or the industries in those hazardous area, to cope up using their own materials. Okay, they require an external help to cope up with the loss. That's what we call as disaster. Okay. Next one, a disaster is classified as natural disaster or man-made disaster depending upon their causes. So, natural disaster. Okay, natural disaster is an adverse event that results from the natural process of the earth. Such as examples of the natural disasters are cyclone, flood, tsunami, earthquake, uh, global warming, ozone depletion, landslides, earthquakes. Okay, they are natural disaster. They are further classified into meteorological disaster, topological disaster, and the environmental disaster. On the other hand, man-made disasters happen due to the technological growth. For example, uh, industrial accidents, chemical spills, fire, radioactive spills, and war, terrorism, internal conflict. This also comes under man-made disaster. They are classified as accidental or intentional one. Next one, we are going to see the terminologies in the disaster. The first one is hazard. Hazard is defined as the dangerous phenomena or a human activity or condition which cause loss of life, injuries, or other health impacts, and loss of livelihood and environmental damage. Anything which cause damages to life or society or environment is categorized as hazard. Next one, vulnerability. Vulnerability is referred as human condition that is attribute to physical, social, economical and environmental factor which determine the livelihood and the scale of damage from the impact of hazard, which is nothing but the condition of the people who can be affected from as a result of disaster. Okay, that we call as vulnerability. Next one, capacity. Capacity is nothing but the materials they have, resources the affected people have in the hazard zone to reduce the impact of the disaster. That is, it is defined as the manner in which an individual, a collection of individual or an organization use the available and existing resources under their limit to limit the impact of the disaster. The things they have within themselves before the disaster to reduce the effect of impact, the effect or the impact of the disaster. That's what we call as capacity. Next one, risk. A risk is a combination of probability of an event and its negative consequences. That is, it is about predicting the impact of the disaster. how extent it will affect the people, community, or environment. Those prediction event probability is called as a risk. A risk assessment. How will we assess the risk? That is how to determine it. Risk assessment is a methodology to determine the nature and extent of the risk by analyzing the potential hazard and evaluating the existing condition of vulnerability that together could potentially harm the exposed people, property, services, living good, and environment on which they depend. Okay. Next one is risk management, which is nothing but a systematic approach and practice of managing uncertainty to reduce the potential harm and losses. Previously, we have seen about the definition of disaster, types of disaster, and terminology involved in disaster. We are going to see about disaster management. Disaster management is a continuous and integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures which are necessary. Disaster management usually is a creation of plan through which community reduce the vulnerability to hazard and cope up with the disaster. It does not completely eliminate the threat, but it focuses on creating plans to reduce the effect of disaster. Disaster management is a responsibility of all spheres of government. The aim of disaster management is prevention of danger of any disaster, reduction of risk of any disaster or its severity or its consequences, capacity building so that the people can cope up with the materials they have, preparedness to deal with any disaster, precautionary steps to reduce the effect of disaster, which include and response to any threatening disaster situation or disaster, assessing the severity or magnitude of effect of disaster so that we can take necessary step for uh, evacuation, rescue, and relief. And last, it includes rehabilitation and reconstruction of the hazardous zone. Now, we are going to see about the phase of disaster management. It consists of 5 phases. First one is disaster preparedness, disaster impact, disaster response, disaster recovery, disaster mitigation. Preparedness means the continuous cycle of planning, organizing, training, and exercising the activity to ensure the enhancement of capacity of the communities, social society, and government in order to prevent and protect the effect of disaster. Usually, preparedness is an multi-sectoral activity which include coordination of variety of sector to carry out. That is evaluation of risk, adopt standard and regulation, organizing communication and response mechanism, ensure all resources ready and easily mobilable, develop social education awareness programs, coordinate information with the news media, and disaster stimulation exercises. The appropriate disaster response depends upon the assessment of the impact. Disaster impact are physical and social disturbance does an hazard agent inflict when it strikes the community. The disaster impact comprise of both physical and social impacts. Physical impacts are casualties and property damages, which can be easily measured and first reported by the medias. Social impact includes psychological problem, economic and political impact. Next one is disaster response. The response is an intervention during or immediately after the disaster to meet the immediate need of community affected by it. It is mostly based on the uh, assessment of the impact so that it the senior management of the private or public institution to make an informed choice and counter mechanism. The typical measures include implementation of plan, activation of counter disaster system, search and rescue of the peoples, provision of food, shelter, medical to the injured community, survey and assess of the impact of disaster, evacuation measures. Next one is disaster recovery, which includes repatriation and rehabilitation. Once the disaster is over, the displaced people return to the place of origin. It is called repatriation. Once the people has reached the place of origin, next step the rehabilitation begins. That is restoration of basic social functions. It includes providing temporary shelters, stress debriefing for the responders and victims, psychosocial rehabilitation, scientific damage assessment. It also includes the element of recovery, that is community recovery, which includes psychologically, infrastructure recovery, which includes a reconstruction of the services such as water line, pipelines, transportation, and communication lines. Economical recovery includes financial and political assessment. Environmental recovery includes rehabilitation of the lost ecosystem. Next one is disaster mitigation. Mitigation means long-term measure undertaken to protect and strengthen the existing vulnerable element to minimize the adverse impact of natural hazard, technological hazard, and environmental degradation. That is the past lesson we learned from the disaster management, and for the future we have to be prepared for the disasters. So each few examples are natural disaster management acts, public education about the disaster, national building code of reference, so that it includes the strengthening of the buildings against the cyclones or any other man-made disasters, zoning the map of the country so that the hazardous zones can be easily identified. These are the few references I have taken for this presentation.